GitHub Copilot with Damian Brady.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm that serves companies building mission-critical software systems. A quick announcement, we are in the second year of my architect forums. Sign-ups for the next session are up. If you lead a .NET software team and are looking to collaborate with other peers who also lead .NET teams, then just sign up at the link in the show notes. And I'm also launching a new software leadership forum for technical executives who oversee software engineering groups. That's CTOs or VPs of engineering, engineering directors, all of the people who oversee software development in your company, but are not directly working in those teams, committing code yourself, but you're accountable for those teams working well. This forum is for you, and it'll focus on topics specific to management and leadership for software engineering departments. And if you work in one of those teams and you need your manager to be in that forum, then please tell them about it. And for those of you who are looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, you can just search for them in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. I have a returning guest today on the show, Damian Brady, and he was kind of giving us the latest on GitHub and Copilot last summer, but he is a staff developer advocate at GitHub. And he's a developer, speaker, and author specializing in DevOps, MLOps, developer process, and software architecture. He was formerly a cloud advocate at Microsoft for 4 years, and before that, a developer at Octopus Deploy. And he's also been a Microsoft MVP, and he has a 25-year background in software development and consulting in a broad range of industries. In Australia, he co-organized the Brisbane Net User Group and launched the annual Domain-Driven Design Brisbane Conference. But Damian, welcome back to the show. How are you, sir?
Good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Your bio says 25 years. We need to keep updating that because the years keep ticking along.
It's kind of rough, I think. It depends. It depends if you count when I was being paid or when I finished university, things like that. I think if you go from when I first started writing code, we're probably at about 30, 35, something like that. So I don't count those.
Well, for the listeners who have not heard any of your past appearances on the podcast, maybe take us back. I want to get into what's going on with GitHub and Copilot there, but take us back because you spent a lot of years as a developer. And now you're working on things that make developers' lives better as opposed to just developing business applications. You remember what was the turning point where that started to interest you?
It's interesting. I think back when I was at Octopus Deploy, maybe even earlier than that, I kind of started becoming interested in all of the stuff around writing code. I used to have a joke when I was at Octopus Deploy. They're quite big now, 120 something people, I think, last I heard.
Yeah.
When I joined, I think I was employee number 5 or something.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to joke that I was like the 4th best developer or something like that in the team. And
out of 5.
Out of 5, yeah. And I'm fine. Like I'm a decent dev, but they had a whole team of rock stars at the time. And then when I left, there was 15 or 20 people, and I was about the 14th or 19th best developer there.
Oh.
But I think what I learned at the time was I was much more interested in the stuff that surrounds software development. So the things that improve developers' lives day to day and dev teams' lives. So we're talking primarily about DevOps, which was in the bio as well. And so the process of getting an idea into the hands of customers, like everything that happens during that. I think in recent years, especially since joining GitHub, I've been interested a little bit in what you could call the inner loop. So the day-to-day, like what a developer does when they pick up a task, like there's a thing that they need to do. How does that process go for them when they're actually trying to write the code to develop and like deliver that piece of software?
Yeah.
So the outer loop stuff about, planning your work on one side and making sure the team is efficient and working according to whatever practice they want to work in. So Scrum, any kind of agile stuff. And then the other side of it, which is the deployment stuff, CI/CD. Those are very interesting problems and definitely worthwhile investigating. But that inner loop kind of sometimes gets overlooked. How difficult is it to pick up a new piece of work? How difficult is it to write the code or to understand the code base that you've been given that you're not that familiar with? And I think that has become much more interesting to me, especially as I've kind of jumped around between different projects and different languages, even different ecosystems, the whole like open source ecosystem, going in to try and modify a code base that you've never seen before. Like how easy is it to actually get that up and running? Yeah, I'm old enough to remember the days where, if you have two projects on a .NET framework, different .NET framework versions, nightmare. How do you actually develop both of those, projects at the same time? Well, you can't because they don't overlap very well. Like that problem's been solved obviously in .NET for a while, but that kind of how do I get everything set up so I can start developing is a tricky thing to manage. But we've made some pretty big leaps there lately.
Yeah. That's an interesting problem. Just as a quick aside, you mentioned inner loop. There's probably some listeners who need some context. You've got the inner loop of what developers do. Then you got the team loop where, multiple developers have something ready and they're ready to share it with the team so that everybody has what they worked on. Then you have a product management, you can call it something different, a product management loop where people outside the development team are looking at stuff, figuring out, do we push it out to our customers? Then you've got the go live loop, the production loop. And then if you're selling software, you have a customer support loop where users are using the software and maybe needing some help with it and giving feedback or saying something's broken. And those all have different processes, but you're right. Even before a developer has something done and ready to send a pull request or share it with the team, there's a lot of work and a lot of cycles and things that can cause that to go faster or slower.
Yeah, exactly right. And that can be as simple as how fast can you type the code, but also, how if somebody asks you to do review a pull request, how quickly can you actually, or how effectively can you actually review that pull request without, having to undo all the work that you've done before? So the two things that really helped with that were at GitHub were code spaces and then the AI stuff, surprisingly. So, Copilot massively improves the speed, getting up to speed kind of stuff. So that's been exciting for the last little while. And I like kind of working out how to use those tools to improve that kind of inner loop. And that's where my interest is right now.
Nice. Well, you spoke at the recent Build conference just a couple months ago, and there are some big, Copilot announcements and lots. I mean, there's things that you can announce, but then there's just new stuff that's always coming about, and we're kind of learning how to use it the most. What are we don't have time to kind of go through everything, but what are the high points where for people who need to catch up, what can they use GitHub Copilot for today?
Yeah. So, I mean, to set a little bit of context as well, GitHub Copilot was originally launched in about 2021, I believe. And it went through the, usual stages of like a private previews and technical previews and things like that. But since then, it's matured quite a lot. So we introduced Copilot Chat shortly after that, a year after that, I think. And then very recently, I think it was about in April, we announced or released, I guess, in technical preview, Copilot Workspace. Now, these are all the GitHub Copilot ones. That simultaneously, or kind of on the tail end of that, Microsoft has started releasing a bunch of Copilots that you would have seen as well. Yeah. So that name Copilot was kind of chosen. It spread a lot because it's a very good way of describing how you should treat these tools, where you are the pilot, you're the one in charge, and you have an assistant, something to help you. So GitHub Copilot and all of the other Copilots, the Microsoft ones, they're not trying to be the one in the driver's seat. They're tools basically to assist you rather than something that's taking the reins. And you can go into a lot of, the technical details about different types of AI and how much control they have and things like that. But the key here, and one of the really big driving forces with GitHub Copilot especially, is to keep the developer in control and just have a really effective, really useful tool. So the highlights, I guess, so GitHub Copilot was originally a little bit like a fancy autocomplete or IntelliSense, I guess.
Yeah. Multi-line IntelliSense.
Yeah, basically. And not always multi-line. Like sometimes it just completes the line you're doing right now. Sometimes it gives you a whole function. Which is a tricky engineering problem, right? How much code do you give somebody? What's an appropriate response from the large language model under the covers?
Build me an e-commerce application. Go.
Yeah, which is interesting because as an autocomplete, that doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah.
Putting a comment to say build an entire application, go. That doesn't really make sense. The small context of what you're giving it and the small amount of response that you want to get is a little bit more like IntelliSense. It's slightly higher, there's slightly more information that you want to come back. So you could say, write a function to give me or to calculate the first 10 prime numbers, and it'll give you that whole function.
Yeah.
But it's not going to give you, an application with a front end and all that kind of stuff. It's not going to give you the whole file. Chat kind of expands that a little bit in a number of ways. So Copilot Chat was released 2022, I think, and it kind of expanded that scope in terms of you can ask it to write like an entire file. Like, can you write a sign up page for this application? And depending on the other files that you have open and the other context it knows, it can copy kind of the way that you write your code and the language and the techniques and things and build that whole page for you. But it's also a bit more conversational. So you can do things like pull up a brand new project and open a file and ask it to explain what that file does, or highlight some code and say, can I make this more efficient? And it does a pretty good job of, doing a little bit more than just an autocomplete. It's definitely moved beyond that. Copilot Workspace, which we announced at GitHub Universe last year in 2023 and has hit technical preview now. We did that around the build timeframe, I'm pretty sure. It is, or a little bit before that, I think it was April. It is taking it a little bit further, where you're talking about multiple files and you're talking about it helping you perform tasks, and emphasis on the word help, right? It's not the kind of thing where we expect you give it an issue and it will just solve everything, because you still need a human in the loop for that kind of stuff. But you can do things like, can you build me a sign up page for this application? And it might create a new, React page, and it might create the database entries in your data layer, and it might create some business logic to make sure that the, email address is being validated and things like that. So it takes it a lot further. So we're kind of starting to expand that scope of what it can help you with, while trying to make sure that the developer is still the one in control. So it's speeding things up and it's helping you. It's even good for things like ideation and exploration. So, hey, what would it look like if I did this? And it gives you a kind of implementation. You're like, okay, I see, not really what I want. And you scrap it and move on to something else. So yeah, we're kind of expanding that scope, but the core is really a tool that helps developers, do their work, I suppose.
Now, with Workspace, am I correct? It seems that way, but am I correct in saying this is specifically for people who are tracking all of the work using GitHub issues?
Not necessarily, actually.
Necessarily.
So GitHub issues is it's usually where you would start. So you would have an issue, you would have all of the discussion. So one of the great things with issues is, you apply labels, you can assign them to people, but you can also have a conversation underneath. So people leave comments and respond to comments and link to other issues and all that kind of stuff. So you can start there, and it will take all of that context as, some information that it needs. So I think it was in the Satya's keynote at Build, where Neha Batra, who is one of the VPs of engineering over here, she did a demo live on stage where she took an issue, which was to add rich text to a particular, like a description field when you're creating a new product. And the decision about what library to use and things like that were all in the discussion from this issue. So you have that collaboration that happens first. And then when you've got it to a point where that discussion has led to some conclusions and, oh, I think we should use this library because we use it elsewhere, and what styles should we do? Taking it from that issue and using Workspace, that's a great way to start if you are tracking issues. But if you have access to Copilot Workspace, you can also start with just a task. So if you're in a repository on github.com, and you obviously need to be signed up to Workspace, which is in technical preview. If you go to the code tab, which is the green button towards the right of the page, there were previously 2 tabs there. So one is, tells you how to clone it locally and how to run it locally. There's another one for starting a code space. So dev environment in the cloud, basically. Workspace adds a third one, which is Copilot, which is just a task. And it gives you a kind of just a plain multi-line text field. And you can just start typing in a thing you want it to do. And then it will spin up a workspace based on what you've asked for and the repository. So that's the other key thing. It knows about all the code in your repository. So it knows what languages you use, what frameworks you use. It understands what understands is always in quotes, by the way.
It's been trained on what is there.
It's been trained. Yeah, that's right. It's very good at predicting the next token around the code that you have. But using that kind of knowledge, it will respond to your task and try to build that out. And so, you don't have to have everything in GitHub Issues. You can start with that task. You can also start just straight from the Copilot Workspace page and just type in the request as well. Like, hey, I want you to build this thing. You can even point at a template repository. So let's say like a plain Hello World React template repository, and then say build a project that does this. And obviously, if you ask for a massive project, it's unlikely to get all of that. But if you ask for, a page to show off your artwork with an about page and something else like that, it's probably going to build most of that based on that template that you've given it. So a few ways to start, but Issues is kind of the core one that we expect people to use, I think.
So for people who already track all their work in Azure boards, this is the Workspace. Does Workspaces connect at all to see or get trained on any of that information?
It doesn't, no. Okay. So if all your stuff is in Azure boards, I believe there are apps and things that can synchronize between Issues and boards, although I'll admit that is not my area of expertise. I know there is some integration between Azure boards and GitHub projects, but I don't know what that looks like these days. Or GitHub Issues, sorry. Yeah.
So there's a lot of discussion and questions and probably fear about, this technology is going to make developer jobs go away and it's going to replace. That's not interesting to me because I mean, the developers are creating all this stuff, so it's not. That's like that's a recursive fear. But and you're in the middle of that. What's the vision of the new way that development can be? And just assume that everybody involved is an experienced software engineer and could type every line of code, yourself, but we're going to use tools to speed up. So have y'all talked about the vision and what could be, and 5+ years down the road when this is all mature and what it might look like?
Yeah, there's we talk about this stuff constantly. There is a team actually inside GitHub called GitHub Next, and they're kind of, you can think of them a bit like the R&D department of R&D department of the company. So a little bit like an analogy I've heard from them actually is that if you think about something like cruise control in cars, that came out of the R&D departments of the car manufacturers, right? And cruise control doesn't take away the driver. Right. It just provides assistance, and it's a tool that started as a pie in the sky kind of, maybe this could work, and got developed into this thing that is generally, most people find useful if you drive any kind of long distances. Kind of similarly, that the GitHub Next team looks for opportunities in technology advancements to be able to assist the job that developers have. So if you think about the trajectory of software development, right? We started with punch cards and then moved to being able to type things on a screen, and then even just little advancements like color screens meant that you could now color code your like syntax highlighting.
Mm-hmm.
So now it's a little bit easier to glance at that code and do that work. And none of that really replaced people. It just provided a bit of a faster way of doing things. Like it was easier to see that code and understand what it did.
Yeah.
And then you got autocomplete and IntelliSense and those things. And again, it's just a faster way of being able to do the things that you need to do. The hard problems are still there. Like how do we solve this business problem with code? Like what do we need to implement and how is that going to happen? But the idea behind tools like GitHub Copilot are really just, how do you, I think in my mind, it's how do you get it from your brain onto the screen faster? Right? And if this technology around AI can help with that process, then that's great. But the core thing that the team is really focused on is to make sure that we're not trying to replace people. So we're just trying to make the job easier and remove the boilerplate stuff that you have to do and remove the tedium and let you focus on the things that only you can do as a developer, which is, understand the problem and understand what the implementation is going to require to solve that problem.
Yeah.
I don't see that going away anytime soon. And it's really clear based on the way these products have been developed that that's what the team cares about. They care about the developer experience rather than replacing people with machines, I guess.
Sure.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
With workspaces, it's fascinating that you could have a series of comments and design decisions. And I'm even thinking a screenshot of a little whiteboard drawing or a little, Wacom tablet drawing of like, here's the structure, here's the sequence diagram of the code, and choosing a particular library and it kicking out the text. The question is, where is the boundary between non-deterministic and deterministic? Because the compiler needs determinism, and that's why we have to speak code, because every time that code is run, it's going to do the same thing. But every time a prompt, or every time we ask a Gen AI tool like Copilot to do something, well, it might give us something that's different, right? And if we generate something, and then we run this code, and then some user reports a bug. I mean, you could assert there is a bug in this code. Where is it? But if it was just generated fresh, it might be like, there is no bug in this code,
Yeah, it's actually interesting that one of the techniques for checking that a large language model has, and sorry, I'll come back to that in a sec, but one of the ways that you can relatively effectively check whether a large language model has made a mistake is to ask a large language model whether there's a mistake. It's weird that it can... It's hard to describe these things without anthropomorphizing or applying intelligence to them that doesn't actually exist there. Right. It's just completion. But being able to look at some code that was generated and then paste that code in and then highlight that code and say, hey, can you find the bug in this? And it says, oh yeah, the bug is on line 25. You just generated this. It's still relatively good at doing that. That, however, is not a replacement for an expert person who knows what to look for and knows those edge cases and things like that. I'll come back to the large language model part, because just to make sure that people are aware as well, all of the copilots that I think Microsoft and GitHub are using are based on large language models, so your GPT models in general. There are some additional like AI or ML models that we use that are really lightweight and fast that that do extra things, so extra filters and things like that. But for the most part, the responses you get come from, depending on which Copilot you're using or which flavor of it you're using. GPT, I think 3.5 Turbo or 4 Turbo, or even I think Workspace, they've started experimenting with GPT 4.0, so the brand new one. And so what it's ultimately doing is just doing kind of token completion. Part of the hard problem there is, how do you give it enough appropriate context to say, here's a bunch of code and here's a bunch of relevant information. This is what I want you to complete for me, or this is the answer I want you to give me. And to get that answer, not just make sense, but to get it as accurate and not necessarily deterministic, but based in truth, so grounded is the AI term, as possible. So a lot of the work around that has been what the team's working on, and it's things like making sure that we send the right information, like the correct pieces of code as context, or the correct questions. And then we've expanded that lately to the correct information about the project that's being worked on too. So you're able to now GitHub Copilot chat in the browser, so github.com. There is a Copilot chat you can use in that, the enterprise SKU. You can say things like, where in this code are the tests? And it has indexed all of that code, and it can give you that answer and say, oh, they're in this folder here. You can even do things like, hey, on this page, in this file, are there any functions that haven't been tested? And it's understood, or it's kind of indexed enough of that code to be able to say, oh, it looks like this function hasn't actually been tested. By the way, nice. Here's a test that could work with it. So that kind of, when you talk about determinism, it's a little less about determinism and a little bit more about grounding it in truth and making sure it's giving you actually useful information that's not, hallucinating a bunch of stuff. It's trying to ground it in the real, the stuff that you actually want to know about. Yeah, so that determinism is one aspect. Like, is it going to give you the same thing every time? And you may not actually want that with kind of creative work, but you do want it to not start lying to you about functions that exist. And so a lot of the work has been around that too, because that's the core to a useful product, right? If it's just inventing, functions that you haven't written, that's not going to be terribly useful.
Right. Well, you mentioned this inner loop. If there's a feature of even just adding one field to a screen, and we have a database, well, there's probably a minimum of 3 spots where I'm going to have to go and I'm going to have to add some new field. You got some stuff in the screen, you got some, layer down, maybe you have a command object or a data transfer up, some type of in the middle. Then you've got your entity framework mapping, you've got the SQL migration, so you have a number of things where a new field has to be added there. And so what's the envisioned flow of Workspace, where we've got this comment string of, okay, this is how we're going to do it. It's a well-worn. Does it do it all at once, or do you need to like invoke it once per layer and have it kind of generate the change?
So generally, I'm just thinking about how I would imagine you go through that process. So you would have that question of, hey, can you add let's say it's adding another field to a customer.
Favorite color field.
Yeah, there you go. Favorite color field. So you could literally add or create a task saying, add a favorite color field to the customer object. And it would look through and it would probably get a lot of it. It would probably identify you've got a create customer page, you've got an edit customer page. So obviously they need new form fields. There's some logic in there to add all the stuff to these objects. There's the code objects themselves, like the models themselves, and then there's the database entries. And so it might get all of that because it can see where customer exists and where that's relevant. But it may miss some of them. So the way it generally works is you start with that task or that issue, then it gives you a specification. And the specification is the basically definition of the current state as it applies to what you've asked for. And then its expectation of the future state. So the future state might contain bullet points like the new customer page now contains a favorite color field. The edit customer page contains a new color field. The customer object in here, contains a color field, and then the database entry contains something else like that. But let's say it missed a validation thing. You can iterate on that. So you can say, oh, I'm going to add another item to say, oh, this file needs this in it as well. And so that's where you as the developer kind of get involved. And it's a collaboration between you and the AI. So you modify that specification. There's a experiment they're doing as well where you can ask for modifications in natural language too. Mm-hmm. So rather than adding that bullet point yourself, you could say, oh, we also need to make sure validation includes the color field as well. And it will refresh those ones and say, oh, okay, here's another line. It iterates on that with your help. When you're fine with the spec, then you can get it to generate a plan. And the plan's just a more detailed, here are the files that need to change and exactly how they need to change. And again, you can add new files to that. You can create new files, add other files to be edited, change the details of what's going to be edited in those files, and then get it to implement. And so then it will go through and implement the changes in those files and show you all of the diffs and things like that. You can modify those changes directly, like right in Workspace. You don't need to do a branch or open your editor or anything like that. You can do it right there. Or you can go back and modify the plan and get it to regenerate a particular file or something like that. So you can interact basically at every one of those stages. At the moment, that's kind of unidirectional. So if you edit the spec, then generally you need to regenerate the plan and then regenerate the files. Or if you edit the file and then re-implement it from the plan, it's going to wipe over your stuff. I can see a future where it is a little bit more collaborative. So if you change some code, it updates the plan. And there's elements of that too. So you can modify a file and then press a button to add that file back into the plan. But it doesn't really describe what you've done, what you've changed. So I know the next team's looking at this as well, where you can, the future of this, I guess, is that it's a bit more of a collaborative two-way thing where it makes sense, you might change the code and it'll update the plan and the specification. And where it makes sense, you update the specification because you want it to help build that all the way through. But the idea is really that it's this collaborative thing. And so it does a lot of the work for you, but you are there to kind of guide it and make modifications where necessary and correct it when it's wrong and make those changes, so on. So you could probably get most of the way there first iteration, but it might miss a few things. You might have to ask it to add some new things, modify some of the code yourself, things like that. Yeah.
Well, I know it's in preview. It's primarily through the website. Is it intended to work, like for .NET developers? Is it intended to work when they're working in Visual Studio?
Great question. I think it's a little bit too early to decide, for them to decide. The way that they've described it to me from the GitHub Next team is that they really wanted to build a thing that they can iterate on quickly, and basically separating that from a particular editor or IDE means that they can make changes to that quite quickly and iterate on the ideas and that kind of stuff without having to get everybody who's using it to install a new extension or maintain multiple extensions. So the way it's implemented right now is basically its own website kind of that hangs off GitHub. Where that ends up in the future, don't know. It could just be a Visual Studio Code extension or Visual Studio extension, or it could stay the way it is, or it could, be built into some other tool or something.
Yeah.
They make deliberate choices not to kind of commit to those things right now while they're getting what's the product fit, I guess, is the right thing, but make sure it's actually a useful product. So yeah, I can't really answer that. It's
early. Yeah,
it's very early. Yeah, it's still like a technical preview with a wait list. So
right. Well, it's probably not technically hard to just funnel in information from Azure boards or heck, even Jira, because it's like, all of those tools have APIs, just need a connector, but just to have the model be grounded with the information of the issue that is currently being worked on. And so many teams do feature branching and branch for a particular issue. So if we know that, okay, I'm currently working under this issue and now we're grounded with all of the comments and everything and all the design decisions, just having that information have trained when the Copilot IntelliSense is happening, that right there is in the IDE. Because I'm imagining a situation where I've been dealing with this code base for a long time. I know exactly where to put the favorite color. I know how many layers. And for the database side, I've already got an integration test that throws the customer to the database, rehydrates it back, checks to make sure that everything. So I'm going to go to my integration test and I'm just going to add one more field and I'm going to run the test. It fails because it's missing a field. And then I just want Copilot to modify the code necessary to make this test pass. And so if the model has been grounded on the issue and what we're doing, and now I even have a failing test, seems like, it could guess a good suggestion.
Yeah, almost certainly. Yeah. So one of the recent updates to Workspace was that it now follows, or it follows is not the word I was looking for, but if you're in a particular branch and you create a workspace, it'll stay in that branch or it'll base it on that branch. So if you had a branch and you, like you said, did that integration test and that test fails, and then committed that change to the branch and then start from the branch and say, hey, this test is failing, can you fix the test? That's probably, it's going to pick up a lot of that information, most likely. So that could definitely be a way of doing the work. I feel like I should try that now.
Whether it's strict test-driven development or if it's just test with development, if the tests and the code are being developed together, then that's a huge ball of context to ground the model when it's suggesting, when it's giving us its turbo intelligence.
Yes. Yeah. One of the definitely. One of the things that's worth mentioning as well is that indexing of the code, though, requires that the code is in GitHub, because that's we need to train on the code that's in there, or we need to be able to index that code that's in there so that when we say what is relevant to this particular question, we have a good way of retrieving that information. That's you've probably heard of it, the retrieval augmented generation or the RAG pattern. That's the way it works. And we get the question a lot, can we use this stuff with code that's not in GitHub? And the short answer is, for that stuff, no. You can absolutely use Copilot on code that isn't in a GitHub repo, but you're not going to get that indexing. You're not going to get that understanding of what the code is actually doing. Even the question of what about if it's in Azure repos, turns out the architecture underneath those two products is a bit different, and it would be a massive engineering effort to reproduce that for another project. So we've made the decision, I guess, that no, the code needs to live in GitHub for us to be able to provide that appropriate grounding in the code.
So that workflow might cause the extensions or the habits or a hotkey to do a micro commit and push operation.
Awesome.
just to all right, do a micro commit and push there. Now there's the info. Now give it to me.
Now it's in GitHub. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. But again, it's early.
Yeah, exactly. The indexing might take a few minutes too. So you may not get that immediately.
Okay.
I'm guessing these things though.
But just aspirationally, what would be super exciting is you make a modification or enhancement or a new test. Boom, you have a failing test. And it is, give me some suggestions to make this test pass.
Yeah. And you can kind of do that like in just Copilot in the editor right now. As long as you have the right files open and things like that, you could say this test is failing. Can you tell me why? Or can you fix the test? There's actually in Copilot, there's a / command. It's like /fix, and that will identify an issue in code and try to fix it for you. But yeah, a failing test may be a bit different. You could say this test is failing. Can you have a look at why? That kind of interaction model of preempting your question by saying, hey, there's a thing that's gone wrong. Here's how I think you should fix it. Or here's a thing that's gone wrong. You should be aware of it. And also here's how you fix it. Has started to enter other parts of the product too, because that's an interesting problem to solve. Like that's a very useful problem. The GitHub Advanced Security product, where it can identify, or one of the features of that is code scanning, where it can have a look at your code and say, look, it looks like this code may introduce a vulnerability. It's vulnerable to a SQL injection attack, for example. There was a feature of that we added, which was originally called autofix. I'm not sure the status of that at the moment, but the idea is not just here's an issue, but also here's a fix for that issue. And then you can just merge that with a couple of clicks, or you can say, I want to investigate this more, open it in the code space or create a branch or something. But that is a bit more of a preemptive or like the AI driven workflow where it is identifying something that you should be aware of. And I feel like there's definitely opportunity for that to start entering as well. So you write some code and you say, this looks great, and you commit it, and Copilot comes back and says, just so you know, like, you haven't written a test for this. Do you want to do that too? That kind of scenario. I can see a lot of opportunity for that too, but we've only got so many people and only so much bandwidth. So yeah, prioritizing all the things you'd love to do is a hard problem.
Well, it's so interesting, and I know you're in a product management space where you're trying to predict the features that most people would actually use without developing too many features that end up not being used. You're going to have a mixed bag. That's just the way it is. But we're trying to guess, like, okay, what's going to be a neat feature and what's going to be a game-changing feature?
Yeah. I'm really impressed. This is just in general as well. When I came over to GitHub, I'm really impressed with the way that the company kind of treats those opportunities. So, you have an idea of, I think this is going to be fantastic, and you implement it, and you add it, you put it behind a feature flag, and you staff ship it, and then you ship it a little bit more broadly. But part of that deployment is watching what people do with it and whether it is actually solving the problem that they want to solve. And I've seen firsthand things that I thought were great ideas and the team thought were great ideas, and then they shipped it and figured out and worked out that it didn't actually align with what people really wanted. And even without digging too much into what information, like without trying to look too much into what people's code looks like and things like that, you can identify, well, this person turned the feature on and then turned it off a few weeks later, and that's happening a lot. Let's try and investigate why, and then changing that direction. This is part of the whole, ship to learn idea, where you're shipping an idea thinking that it's probably going to be really good, and either it is or it isn't, and either way you've learned something. That's generally the way that these features get shipped. I think we don't commit to these things super early, which is, again, why Workspace is in technical preview and why it's not tied to an IDE or anything like that. They're iterating on it fast to make sure it's actually doing the things that they want it to be able to do. It's a good way of writing software. It's a very kind of humble way of writing software. You don't know better than the person using it. You let them use it and let them give you feedback on whether it's useful or not.
Right. Well, awesome. As we close up here, where's the best place for people to get started on investigating Copilot Workspace?
So probably, one thing that you would definitely want to do is sign up for the waitlist if you're interested. So I can give you the links for show notes and things like that, but gh.io/copilot-workspace. I think if you did a search for GitHub Copilot Workspace, you'll be able to find it. But there's a fantastic blog post that kind of goes through what it is and how it works and what the vision is and things like that. Yeah, so I think GitHub Copilot Workspace, if you just search for that, that's very easy to find. Or sign up for the waitlist, which is gh.io/copilot-workspace.
Awesome. All right. Yeah, we'll include a link to that in the show notes so people can do that.
Yeah.
Well, Damian, thanks so much for coming back on the show and kind of updating us on all things GitHub Copilot. This is great.
Awesome. Yeah, great to be here. Thanks.
Oh, my pleasure. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.